Assertion, forgiveness and love. Luke chapter 6, verses 27 to 38. If you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to take it back to him. If you see the donkey of someone who hates you fallen down under its load, do not leave it there. Be sure you help him with it. If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. Hi. When others hurt or oppress you, how do you respond? When you've been wounded or felt diminished? Jesus has some things to say about this. In the passage that we're going to look at in Luke, he presents a way of love and grace that doesn't require us to be a doormat, a way that challenges the perpetrators of violence potentially to be shamed into changing their ways. But even if that doesn't happen, a way for us to retain dignity and not be driven to respond in the same kind of manner in which the perpetrators have acted. Jesus is re-establishing the law of love in broken circumstances. Let's hear what he has to say. But I tell you, hear me, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. If someone takes your cloak, do not stop him from taking your tunic. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. In 1987, an IRA bomber blew up a bomb in Northern Ireland and buried, amongst others, Gordon Wilson and his 20-year-old daughter beneath 5 feet of rubble. Gordon alone survived, and he forgave almost immediately. He said of the bombers, "I have lost my daughter, but I bear no grudge. I shall pray tonight and every night that God will forgive them." And his words at the time caught the media's attention, and out of one man's grief and amazing grace, the world got a glimpse of love and forgiveness. As we look into this passage today, I'd like us to reflect on some thoughts that theologian Walter Wink had a few years ago about this passage. His insights bear some listening to. Let's reflect together on this passage. Firstly, when someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn the other one to him as well. Wink says a right-handed blow in a right-handed world would land on the left cheek. To strike the right cheek with a fist would require the left hand, but the left hand was only used for unclean work. You could be punished, in fact, for using your left hand in other ways in the Middle East. So the only way to strike someone's right cheek with your right hand would be with the back of the hand. which means Jesus is describing an insult, not a fist fight. He's talking about the violent humiliation of a slave owner or Roman soldier towards the oppressed people of Galilee. This was an unequal relationship in which violent retaliation would invite retribution. Turning the other cheek in the face of such humiliation would stop the oppressor and assert one's dignity, equality, and humanity. It would put the oppressed on equal footing, and Wink says that what it's saying is, I deny you the power to humiliate me. I'm a human being just like you. Gandhi later said something similar when he said this: the first principle of non-violent action is non-cooperation with humiliation. Walter Wink's insights change everything we know about this passage. Jesus doesn't want us to passively suffer the violence of our oppressors. He wants us to non-violently resist their injustice. He wants the oppressed to risk non-violent action for the sake of their liberation. He tells us we're not helpless, we're not powerless, we should not be despondent, and he calls us to do something. Next, Jesus says, if anyone wants to go to law with you over your tunic, hand him your cloak as well. In Jesus' time, as in ours, the poor were forever in debt. People wore outer and inner garments. But as Wink writes, they were hauled into the court and sued even for the clothes off their back. And only the poorest, those whom Jesus addressed, would have nothing but an outer garment to give as a loan. So when they demand your outer garment, he says, give them your inner garment as well. But if a poor person was sued in court for his outer garment and gave away his inner garment too, if he had one, he would find himself naked before the court, which was not only taboo in Judaism, but actually criminal. But it wasn't for the poor person. In those days, it was illegal to look upon a naked person. Jesus' audience would immediately realize that the judge and the soldiers would actually have to arrest themselves for violating the law, and the poor person would go home free. And Jesus is teaching the oppressed not to be awed by power, but to respond creatively. These are just examples, but to find ways to, as it were, disarm their opponents and non-violently liberate themselves. Jesus offers, in Wink's words, a practical, strategic measure for empowering the oppressed. Jesus again, should anyone press you into service for 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Now, Roman soldiers forced the poor very often to carry their heavy packs for them. By law, however, the soldiers were not permitted to force the poor to walk more than 1 mile with their packs. These Galileans were totally oppressed and terrorized by these Roman occupiers. Jesus shows them a way to non-violently resist the soldiers. Go an extra mile, he says. His audience would understand that any soldier would be arrested for breaking the law and imprisoned. If everyone in Galilee did this, all Roman soldiers would be imprisoned. Now, Jesus doesn't say kill the Roman soldiers or fight them. He does not advocate either sitting back and passively suffering their oppression. He teaches creative, non-violent resistance to transform the situation without violence. You are not helpless, he insists. Take control of the agenda. Use creative, non-violent action to end the oppression. Give to the one who asks of you, he says next. Instead of making money and hoarding it, he overturns capitalism and teaches us to give to those in need, even sacrificially. And as Luke explains, without asking for anything in return. Be generous, selfless givers. Jesus counsels his hearers not just to give alms, says Wink, and to lend money, but to do that even to bad risks, but to lend without expecting interest or even the return of the principal itself. And finally, Jesus says, do not turn your back on one who wants to borrow. Lend to others. Don't turn your back. Be generous. If we applied these economics socially and globally, we would end our hoarding. We would return the resources we have stolen from the poor. We would feed the hungry, house the homeless, heal the sick, and never turn our backs on anyone ever again. From now on, we would look one another in the eye, treat everyone with respect and dignity, and reclaim our common shared humanity. Now, just a caveat or two here for this passage. While this would be fantastic if every human being on the planet exercised this way of living, I said in my last message, and I'm saying again, that Jesus here is firstly addressing those who've chosen to follow him. The lifestyle he espouses of love and grace here will obviously over the centuries feed into the mainstream culture. He is initially saying that, though, that those who would be like Rabbi Jesus will have to come to terms with copying him in a broken and fallen world, living out loving forgiveness. And that's not easy. And at the time, it was indeed a radical call to recapture, as it were, the vibe of what the Old Testament was pointing towards. Maybe you wouldn't choose to categorize people in the category of enemies as such. One of my children, when they were very little, described another kid at school as follows, "That boy is my enemy." It was hard not to smile and just quietly parent him into not thinking of others in such black and white terms. But Jesus is here speaking to a crowd who are in fact living under the iron boot of Roman occupation, perhaps I should say iron sandal or hobnail boot of occupation. And this teaching had immediate and obvious consequences. Now, this teaching, when we compare it to, say, Matthew or Mark's version, is actually gently subversive. What do those who have no power do to retain dignity and agency in such circumstances? They find ways to assert that they are human too. You see, there were rules for Roman soldiers, and we've described them. You could take a cloak for a period of time, but not a tunic, and so on and so forth. You could force someone to go an extra mile, but not force them to go further. As a soldier, you could get in trouble. In some ways, Jesus is teaching here what is a forerunner to the non-violent protest movements of the 20th century, particularly in the area of not feeling the victim all the time. It is exemplified in Jesus' own agenda that feels so counterintuitive to the disciples. He goes to the most horrendous of deaths, death on a cross, where he is killed under the authority of the Jewish and Roman leaders. They think they control the agenda. They think Jesus is losing all dignity by being naked on that cross. But there is a deeper magic going on, to quote Narnia. Jesus has a plan of love and forgiveness. So to love and forgive can be about retaining dignity. It's not simply about being a doormat. It means exercising some control in broken situations as much as you are able. So for example, I can remember at school walking away from a fight. I know I could have won at school. The kid was a lot smaller than me, but I chose not to respond in kind. I found it quite humiliating and difficult at the time. But in a sense, I walked away. I undermined the authority of the crowd that was saying, "You've got to fight back, you've got to fight back." I was not controlled by the circumstances of the situation. And maybe, maybe not, I answered to a higher call, the call of love. Certainly I don't like violence. Think about personal offences. It's hard to say how this teaching of Jesus applies on a nationwide scale. Though, of course, it's pretty obvious if everyone lived this way, we would be living in utopia. But the reality is we do need police to retain law and order, to restrain evil. And some Christian denominations, however, would argue for a pacifistic worldview. I wouldn't quite go that far. I think armed forces are needed, though the issue of what is a just war is an extremely vexed question, particularly after wars like Vietnam or Iraq in recent years. So my sense here is that Jesus is not talking on the macro scale, but on the personal level, first and foremost, though the consequences of this do work their way into the mainstream of Western culture as the years and centuries go by. How do you choose to love and forgive in the face of that bullying Roman soldier in front of you, says Jesus? Or for us, perhaps he would say, how do you choose to love and forgive when your boss or your partner niggles at you, or somebody else is cruel or even abusive towards you? And it's not easy, is it? I mean, it's not a glib, oh, you must obey the command of Jesus, grit your teeth and forgive. No, to do this requires spiritual disciplines and habits of dwelling in God's forgiving love, learning how to live that in the real world of fights and arguments and disagreements. That therefore ultimately requires a supernatural touch of God. But don't hear me wrong here. God rarely seems to zap us in some kind of hyper charismatic way. He expects us to pray for power, but also to develop lifestyle habits. You don't run a marathon by just turning up on the day of the race. You train for it. How you love your wife, your boss, your partner, the person who's hurt you in minor ways, the friend. It's not easy. And you cannot overcome psychological, emotional, or other kinds of abuse just by saying, I have to obey this command and pray a bit harder. That in itself is a kind of abuse, the abuse of a religion that says you ought to do this ought word. We must deal gently with ourselves and with others who struggle to forgive. But the right response comes from a place over a long period of time of deeply indwelling the gracious love of God. If God has forgiven me this much, how can I continue to hold a grudge? And yet I still feel this way. And so retraining your neural pathways, as it were. There's a lot of talk about that at the moment in counseling, about setting up new neural pathways. Well, here's one way to learn to forgive in 101 small ways, so that when the big thing happens, it's been part of your lifestyle for many years to forgive and to be merciful and to be kind, to turn the other cheek. This right to respond in kind, there's a Greek word, anti-stenai, which means to resist violently or rebel with violence. Jesus is saying here, don't use violence to resist evil, whether it's the actual physical violence or the violence of words. Do not continue the downward spiral of violence. He wants us to break the cycle by refusing to cooperate with violence, refusing to retaliate with further violence. Violence in response to violence can only lead to, guess what, more violence. So Jesus is basically saying, don't mirror evil. And we can say, well, we have a right to defend our stuff. That's why we have armies. And our stuff can be our freedom, our property, our right to live in safety, and so on and so forth. But there's a question that Jesus leaves hanging in the air. Jesus was one who gave up his rights to anything. He says, the Son of Man does not have anywhere to lay his head. He gave up his right even to life itself, because he recognized there was something more valuable than asserting our rights. What rights do you cling on to that maybe Jesus would have you give and give up on? Because whenever we assert our rights, we run the risk of seeing this thing that we're asserting as more important than the law of love. But the question, the challenge is left never fully resolved, I guess, in our lives. We have to keep coming back to this question, this challenge. Am I responding with self-assertion, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but asserting my own rights, again, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but is it getting in the way of the law of love? Now, this, of course, is an ethical minefield, and we have to remember that Jesus is trying to make the law of love central in his hearers' minds. So he's just giving examples that were relevant to them. Our job is to reframe it for our own situation. How do I express my feelings, for example, and also assert my dignity, but also love and forgive this person in front of me? And it's not easy. Jesus is not saying be a doormat. When you give your tunic to the soldier, you're showing your skin, you're asserting your dignity and worth. I can think of certain coloured sports heroes here in Australia who've pulled up their sports shirt at various times to demonstrate that they were human, that they had dignity, that they were worth, and they were not worthy of the racial abuse they were receiving from the crowd. But Jesus is making sure that all such protest action is done in love, not aggression. The knock-on effect of Jesus' own ministry penetrated the whole of human culture, certainly Western culture, from Roman culture through post-Roman culture right into the modern era. Roman historian Tom Holland in recent years has highlighted how we wouldn't have human rights or even the concept of mateship or caring for strangers and refugees without the impact of Christianity. None of that kind of thinking existed before the Judeo-Christian tradition. And although he's not a Christian himself, as a historian, he argues that you don't get those things happening in the ancient world, and they don't come from secular humanism. Many people want to argue about that, but I think it's pretty well written up on. So that's one macro effect of this teaching on the whole of culture over the centuries. But just on an individual level, when we refuse to hit back, it can break the cycle of tit for tat. And not only this, when done in the grace of God, it enables you to not feel bound to respond in certain ways. You're free from the need to knee-jerk into violence yourself. This surely is the way forward for all of human relating. Now, we live in a fallen world, and you can't always make social policy or legislate for this kind of behaviour. It begins with a response to the love of God, not with the corporate laws of the land, even if some of those laws can be impacted and affected by such teaching. So if you're deciding how much to spend on armies or what laws, international or otherwise, to live by, then this passage doesn't always talk about such things, but it does call us back to the intention of the Old Testament law, pointing humans towards love. So let's come to our conclusions now. What are we saying here? This idea of assertion, forgiveness, and love, Jesus modeled it. When they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him, along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Here's the thing, this is reality in the real world. This is teaching for real life. It's not pie in the sky, wishful thinking on the part of Jesus. He lived it. So let's not kid ourselves or give ourselves an excuse. Love is not just a warm, fuzzy spiritual feeling. It's the hard-eyed determination to forgive and live this way every day, in a way that Jesus did every day, all the way to the cross. We can't immediately get to the cross ourselves. We have to live this way day after day after day, so that the cross and surviving such an experience in grace becomes possible. Jesus demonstrated it. He modeled it. He who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I too will love him and show myself to him. If anyone loves me, he will obey my teaching. My Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. When we come to faith in Christ, he comes by his Spirit and has us dwelling in the deep fellowship of God's Trinity. That is dwelling in love. And that's what we are promised for those of us who follow Jesus. Paul writes this, and let's conclude with these words. I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the saints to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. May you know this. May you know this reality. May you learn to dwell in love, to assert yourself, yes, to keep your dignity, but always to love. Amen.